Talmadge Heflin. I'm the director of the Center for Fiscal Policy at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and we're glad you're here. How much government is enough? That's one of the things that we should ask ourselves every day if we have any thing to do with government at all, in any capacity. One of the things that we've been promoting at the foundation is to have a better spending limit, tax and expenditure limit. And we've been promoting, it's tied to the estimation of the growth in personal income today. That's estimated every other year before the legislature goes into session. A rate is adopted, and that gives a limit on general revenue not dedicated by the Constitution. And if you know anything at all about the budget, you know that that's not all of the budget, not all the money. But so what are we going to do with that money? How much is enough? And as we've been an advocate for refining that limit, the thing that we haven't addressed is, are we doing everything right now? Do we really need to grow government at all? Do we need to grow at 9%? That presupposes that everything is perfect. We're spending just the right amount. And we believe at the foundation that we should start first us in looking and saying, what amount of government is really needed? And so that's what the topic is going to be about today. It may be delivering, how do you deliver government? Okay, if this is enough or not enough or whatever, but is your delivery system right? Is there a better way that you can deliver the services that government should be delivering for you with your money? We have a panel today that I believe will help us explore that. Started in Texas and then went all over the country and found two of our folks in Texas and then went over to Georgia, I believe, up to Ohio, I think. Found the two best people outside Texas to talk about this. So we have with us this afternoon, and we're getting a late start, so I'm going to be very brief with their introduction and ask them to come up and give comments. And all of you, however you take notes as they speak, be thinking about what questions you want to ask them. And so at the end, we'll have some Q&A from the audience. We have State Representative Phil King from the 61st District, which includes Parker and Wise counties. Representative King serves on the Energy Resources and Pensions Committee and on the board of directors of the American Legislative Exchange Council. And he's the Texas Conservative Coalition Research Institute and is vice chairman of the Texas Legislative Tea Party. He's a lieutenant colonel in the Texas State Guard, and he's an attorney currently practicing. And I've often wondered, like attorneys and CPAs and others, they're always practicing. Will Representative King and Representative Perry ever get it right so they can quit practicing? But anyway, we're fortunate to have Representative King, Representative Charles Perry from the House 83rd District, includes Borden, Grimes, Lubbock, Lynn, Mitchell, Scurry, and Terry County. Representative Perry, did you know you had that many counties? My goodness, I bet you can't name them all, but I won't ask you to right now. I know you can. Serves on the House Appropriations Committee as Vice Chair of the House Committee on Government Efficiency and Reform and the Select Committee on Transparency. He's a member of the Legislative Sportsman's Caucus, Texas House Republican Caucus, and Vice Chair of the Rural Caucus of the Texas Legislature. We have Mr. Oliver Porter. He was the leading proponent of the use of private industry to provide services for local government. And he has an intriguing story. He served as chairman of the Charter Commission volunteer interim city manager and chairman of the Governor's Commission, served as the principal advisor to 5 new contract cities in Georgia, to cities and counties in a number of other states and internationally, I believe, in Japan, if I'm not mistaken. Cited as Innovator of the Year in 2009 by the Reason Foundation. And then we have Dr. Richard Vedder, Distinguished Professor of Economics at Ohio University, Director of the Center for College Affordability and Productivity, and Adjunct Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, author of Out of Work, Unemployment and Government in the 20th Century American Economy and Historical Perspective. Received a BA from Northwestern University and an MA and PhD from the University of Illinois. Now, Dr. Vedder and I share the same birth year. I don't know what month he was born, but when you get to be our age, you can say pretty well anything you want to say. And Dr. Vedder is really good at that. I told him of all the things that was on his resume, one thing that I thought should be there wasn't there, and that's humorist. I believe he can take a serious subject and you'll find a little humor in it in the presentation. We'll start out with Dr. Vedder, please.
Thanks, Tommy. Yeah, 1940 was to human beings what 1961 was to French wines. Very, very good year. That's the year Dick Armey was born, too, come to think of. Speaking of old people, a dear friend of mine in the office, probably the most distinguished economist in the state of Texas, my dear friend Steve Pavich is here. I see there are a lot of people, and his daughter Brenda is on a sleepy little group called the UT Board of Regents. I hear they'd have no controversies at all. And Jeff Judson's, it's great to be here with a lot of old friends. Now, the Lone Star State, by most indicators, is doing pretty good. Unemployment's well below the national average. Income growth has exceeded the national average, not only for the most recent quarter, you were third in the nation, but over the entire span of this century so far. Organizations that go out and evaluate state tax and spending policies and their growth impact give Texas high marks. The Tax Foundation, for example, in D.C. ranks Texas 9th on its Business Climate Index. The Small Business Tax Index ranks you 3rd. I don't have any PowerPoint. This is West Virginia PowerPoint here. 3rd, just use fingers. And the Beacon Hill Institute State Competitive Index ranks Texas very good 7th. So you always rank high in all these indicators. And this is great because there's overwhelming evidence, empirical evidence, that economic prosperity is inversely related to the size of government. Bigger government, less prosperity. Smaller government, more prosperity. Simple. Most of the members of the American Economic Association don't believe that, but they're wrong. The evidence is overwhelming. This means that states with high tax burdens tend to have low rates of growth in income and employment. Texas, for example, has benefited enormously from not having a state income tax. It is no accident that of the top 9 states on the Tax Climate Index of the Tax Foundation, 8 of them do not have an income tax. Do everything in your power to minimize the possibility that you ever will enact one of those taxes. If the tax is not specifically prohibited by the Texas Constitution, and I don't know, is it? Anyway, close that loophole and make that a strong provision. In fact, I favor a system where it requires unanimous consent of the governed to raise taxes. 100%. Not really. Now let me speak of ways that you can constrain the size of government even further than you have. Let me talk about using the political process to mandate limits on taxes and spending, what Talmage was talking about at the beginning. Tax and expenditure limitation can be enacted either constitutionally or statutorily. The statutory limits tend to be ineffective and rarely last more than a few years, and often are followed by spending splurges that often negate their temporary positive impact. Constitutional restrictions, on average, are at least modestly effective, sometimes very effective, in slowing down the growth of government, although their effectiveness does vary considerably. The political forces that favor big government are often very ingenious in finding ways to neuter or negate effective spending or tax constitutional constraints, often using the courts as their vehicle. So it's you have to be very, very careful. And so for a few minutes, and this is tedious stuff after the drama we had at the last session, but it's like probably the equivalent of having a hemorrhoid operation, the intellectual equivalent, so please bear with me. But in trying to limit the size of government constitutionally, there are a lot of questions that come up. Do you put limits on spending, on taxes, or on both? How do you handle federal grants to states in setting spending or revenue limits? Do you include provisions for so-called rainy day funds in your amendment, knowing that revenues and expenditures tend to automatically rise and fall for reasons related to the business cycle? How do you handle government-owned enterprises that have fees or user charges, such as universities or hospitals, or income from endowments, such as provided constitutionally to the University of Texas or Texas A&M? If you limit taxes, how do you more generally control for fees and user charges? How do you prevent state governments from imposing unfunded regulatory mandates on private enterprise, where previously government funds have been used to finance some given activity? Do you provide provisions for overrides of constitutional constraints in an emergency by supermajority legislative votes and or by a supermajority of the people? So in short, constructing a solid amendment impervious to judicial challenge is very tricky, but not impossible. You need to consult good lawyers, but also those with experiences in other states with TEL amendments. California led the way in the 1970s using this approach, and the Colorado Tabor Amendment also has a history that should be observed by anyone planning constitutional change. These are places you ought to look for some guidance. I can't go into much detail here, but typically you would want to define government spending and revenues very, very broadly to include local jurisdictions. You don't want to exclude the locals, or legislators are just going to push stuff off on local governments and the spending will occur there. You do want to try to avoid abrupt reductions in spending in recessionary periods, so you probably want to have some sort of rainy day provisions of some sort. This was a big problem in the Colorado Tabor experience and probably did it in. You want to try to constrain government pushing off spending on private enterprises through sort of unfunded mandates of one sort or another, making people building highways to their plants and everything themselves rather than governments do it, etc. The one problem in trying to close all the loopholes is that it tends to lead to long, difficult to understand amendments. So there's a trade-off between simplicity and clarity on the one hand and having an amendment that is relatively immune from challenges from special interest groups. Now, there's a little different approach that I've been pushing for years, and absolutely no one has ever listened to me. So I'm going to try once more. I'm a college professor with tenure, so I pretty much, like Talmage says, when you're born in 1940, you do pretty much what you damn well please. So, and they're not paying me a damn cent in honorarium to come here. So, and the reason I come is because I really love TPPF. I just think they're the greatest #1 public policy group in the country, and I've worked for over 30 of them over the years, given talks and so forth. So anyway, here's a different approach. It has pitfalls, but it has some political attractiveness. It might be worth a try. Why don't you provide financial incentives for influential public officials to keep government small and impose financial costs on them if they allow government to be large? Emulate the private sector with stock options and so forth by providing meaningful rewards for political leaders whose actions lead to providing public services at a low price. Suppose the Census Bureau states that total state and local government spending in Texas is 17.5% of personal income. I'm making these numbers up. And suppose legislators make, how much do you guys make? 600 a month. 600 a month? Yeah. Oh my God. God, you're high paid. In New Hampshire, they make $100 a year. No, my state, they make much more than that, and it shows. The government's crappy as, anyway. Let's suppose, let's use an example. Let's take a state where 17.5% of personal income is spent on state and local spending. Legislators make $60,000 a year. Now you're talking. Have that spending stay at the salary stay at $60,000 if the spending remains between 17 and 18% of personal income. That is, if it doesn't change much. But if it falls below 17%, provide a 50% efficiency bonus, increasing pay to $90,000 a year. Or if spending goes up above 18%, up quite a bit, reduce their pay by 25% to $45,000 a year. There would be significant financial incentives to keep government small, counteracting special interest group lobbying to expand spending. Since government size depends not only on the legislature, but also on the governor, the lieutenant governor, and Supreme Court justices, I tie their pay to this too. Now this has its problems. The proposal, there are lags between the time you spend money or spend and tax and the time the results are known, and sometimes you've had changes in offices and you might put the burden on the benefit or the burden on the wrong person. So there's some issues with this, but it can be dealt with. There's still other variants in some states on spending that have worked. For example, in states with big public employee unions, which you don't have here, a paycheck protection provision that prohibits governments collecting dues from workers to fund political action is a highly desirable action. Now, I'm told I only have 8 minutes or 9 or 10 or something, and Texas does have a pretty good record of constraining government. But that could change overnight unless you have adequate ways of constraining government growth. And the more constitutional those ways are, the better. The more that it's hard to change those constraints, the better. Politicians, to me, are somewhat like alcoholics in liquor stores. You leave them alone there for a while, they will cause grave damage to themselves, if no one else. We don't let teenage boys into girls' locker rooms because we know mischief and trouble will come. We have to put constraints on human behavior. Why don't we put constraints on politicians more than we have? It's the sensible thing to do. Give some serious consideration to imposing rules on politicians to make destructive taxing and spending less attractive. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Butler.
Let me ask our timekeeper to identify himself, hold his hand up.
Oh, I didn't see.
He is, look back over there as time wears on. Mr. Porter?
Come out to the center and wave it. Okay. Thank you. Scott Turner and then Dr. Vetter. That's tough to follow. I can only say amen to that. How much government is enough? I don't know. But I do know this. We've got too much. Government is bloated. at all levels, federal, state, local, all need to be constrained. Now, as an individual, there's not much that I, and maybe you can do at the federal level, maybe not even at the state level, but I'm going to speak to you about the local level. And by the way, the local level is the level that affects us the most in our everyday lives. The roads we drive, the water we drink, sewerage, our police, public safety, fire. It's in our everyday lives, and we need to do something about it. And collectively across this country, local government is bloated. We've been doing it the same way for 100 years or more. It's now time to change, and that's what I want to talk with you about. So let me take you to Georgia, to a city called Sandy Springs that was not a city 8 years ago. It's unique and rather remarkable. I say that because it was the first new city in the state in 50 years. We had no blueprint to follow. We had fought for almost 30 years in the legislature to get the right to just have a vote, a referendum about forming a city. We did achieve that with a change of the power structure in our House of Representatives. It's also remarkable because it's at a city of over 90,000 people at birth. It was the 5th largest city in the state at birth. But it is particularly remarkable for this. We started the new city of Sandy Springs, a city of almost 90,000 people, a full scope, fully operational city at birth with 2 employees. 2 employees. How in the world is that possible? Well, when I was asked to take the responsibility for implementing the city, I began thinking in terms of traditional cities. You have your own employees, you have your own assets, you buy equipment, so forth. Unfortunately, the bill that we finally got passed provided no funding, no staff, and most importantly, no authority. Until the minute the city was started, and at that point it had to be fully operational, there was no one with any authority to hire anyone, buy anything, lease anything. So I had a bit of a dilemma. I formed task forces of some very talented volunteers to look at every aspect of service in forming the city, and after about 2 months, I came to the conclusion that it was impossible. It was impossible doing the traditional way, and I began to look for alternatives. And the alternative that appealed most to me was to look to private industry. And maybe that's because my background is in the corporate world, and I began to think about how to do that. Now, time was against us. The bill was not actually signed that would allow us to have a referendum until May of 2005. The referendum was June 8th, and the city had to be started December 1st, 5 months later, and we have nothing. So I began to look to private industry. I sat in my basement office and wrote RFPs to put out for bids for private industry to provide all the services of this city, all except public safety, not fire and police, but all the other services, and those included administration, HR, finance, purchasing, accounting, the backroom operations even for the police, fire, and the courts, E911. It included transportation, the traffic design, traffic control, maintenance of roads and sidewalks. It included parks and recreation programs. It included community development, that is planning, zoning, permitting, code enforcement, and many other smaller aspects. All of those things, we put out a bid request to have private industry come in and create our city. And it did, and it did it marvelously. I judge the success of a local government in 2 ways. First, obviously efficiency. Is it running as efficient as it can? And 2, how responsive is it to the needs of the citizen? And those are equally weighted. You can't separate one from the other. On that basis, Sandy Springs has been an outstanding success, and I want to give you some things to consider when I say that. That's not just my judgment. 1, beginning December 1, 2005, and by the way, our first council met at 1 minute after midnight, December 1st. They sat for the first time together, having been elected 3 weeks before, and they had a fully operational city to run. It was there for them. I judge that, in fact, right after that, we went into this major recession, and cities all over the country have been going bad, bankrupt. We see Detroit is the worst, but it's only the most visible. It's happening in many places, and there are many, many others who really are technically bankrupt. If you take the definition that they have huge debt and they have less money coming in than they're spending, then that's bankruptcy in my opinion. So there are many others on the verge of it. Some have declared. We have an enormous problem in this country with funding our local governments, doing it the way we're doing it. In Sandy Springs, one, we created this new city. We have not raised taxes 1 mil over that period of time, while others have had to raise taxes or cut services. We have built, as a new city with all the startup costs, we have built a $35 million reserve. That's on a budget of about $60 million. Okay? We have put in a massive capital improvement program, paving more roads and streets, sidewalks, over 150 miles of them, more than the county that we were carved out of had ever done the last 30 years for sure. No new tax increases, built a reserve, terrific capital improvement program, services across the board, and I'll talk about that in a minute, improved, and Sandy Springs has 0 long-term liabilities. No debt, no unfunded liabilities for pensions and other benefits, and we never will have. And we never will have. So I think by any measure of efficiency, financial efficiency, that says good things. Now, what's another measure? If you're doing something right, people will follow you. Since Sandy Springs, we've had 6 other new cities formed. I've been the principal advisor for all but one of those. I actually put together a book after Sandy Springs because I was advising all these other cities and I was putting down notes for how do you do it. So it finally just sort of grew into a book, and if you're interested in starting a new city, everything you need to do is here. It's a how to do it guide. Then I was asked by the Japanese well, what about writing a book for existing governments to convert? And that's what we need to be focused on. We're not going to do that many more new cities, although we have 5 more currently being considered in Georgia because it's been such a success. They're all following this model. So I've written a second book on how to convert your existing governments, and we really do need to focus on that. So that's another measure of success. Probably the most important measure of success for what do the citizens of the city think about that and the services they're getting. Obviously, we've done surveys, and they all say it's great. We've been a part of national surveys. We finished in the top 10% of companies, of cities in those polls. But I think one of the best was the first judge of this was the first election after the original election, 4 years later, when the entire council and mayor came up for election. The least vote an incumbent got was 84%. And if any of you are in politics, I think you would agree that may be what we might call that a mandate, that people are happy with what's going on. And we've just gone through our second wave of elections and the same sort of results. So people it has been efficient, it has been responsive. I'll just give you a quick example of responsiveness. We said we don't want people dialing this city with a question and getting this runaround of this digit. Now, I worked with AT&T, so I'm responsible in part for that lousy thing where you have to dial all those numbers. But we don't want that. We want a live response. So in Sandy Springs, 24/7, you get a live person answering your questions. That question goes into a system. The system issues a work order. There's a feedback loop to the council people and the mayor and the city manager, and our people know what's happening to them. So I'm getting a 1-minute signal. It has been a success. We need to expand it. I have targeted Texas to do that. At this point, I'm studying 2 cities in Texas for conversion to this model, and hope that we will be able to do many more. The TPPF has formed a center to focus on local government. I've been collaborating with them on how that can be a success, and they have agreed to sponsor studies, additional studies. So I'll make you this promise. If you have any contact in a local government, either city or county, and you think this has promise for them, we will do a study for them comparing their existing system with what they can do with private contracting, and we will do it at no cost to the city. Secondly, if that study proves to be, to say there are good results that can come from this, either savings or improved service. Then I will do the full implementation, that is writing RFPs for bidding. I do believe in using the competitive process to keep costs down, writing those RFPs, helping with the contract, and actually implementing the city. And again, we'll do that at no cost to the city. It is a no cost, no risk opportunity for the cities of Texas and the counties of Texas to move to a model that has proven to be extraordinarily efficient, and I think in keeping with your thinking probably about how we should, in every instance we can, if there's one job, one person too many on the job, that's too many. And we're solving that, and we're doing it with private industry in the competitive model that we've come up with. So I thank you for your attention, and I hope we'll have some questions about this.
Representative King.
Well, thanks for having me, and got notes somewhere. I actually have a specific proposal I was going to lay out, and it's a little bit confusing. So we've got a little bit of a handout, and have you got something, a little one-page thing? And it's not, the handout doesn't say anything about it, except that it deals with the rainy day fund and an appropriations issue and how you, to structure the proposal. I kind of got to go over the background, so I apologize for being a little bit detailed. Has everybody got that? It's a little one-page thing? No, it's nothing as fancy as in color. This is like right off our printer, looks like this. It's being passed out, okay. All right, good. Well, I'll sing or something until we get up here, but kind of just go over this real quickly so the ESF Economic Stabilization Fund, the Rainy Day Fund proposal makes some sense. So, there we go. I'm sorry. I thought we'd already kind of got them passed out there. Yeah. Thanks for helping, Linda. And you're going to look at it and you go, while we're waiting for this, this is pretty dull and boring. So, there we go. Yeah, Jody's laughing because she knows it's going to be dull and boring. I mean, she's all prepared for this. So. All right, we're close. See, the only reason I'm organized this time, because last time I came and I was over there writing notes like 5 minutes before on what I was going to talk on, so I thought, well, this year I need to make up for it. Has everybody got one? Okay. It's pretty exciting stuff, you can tell. Has everybody got one? All right. If you look at the top, and the top section just kind of is a reminder of, in this last legislative session, the money we spent. HB 10, $6.6 billion. SB 1, $94.6 billion, both of those out of GR. HB 1025, $4.8 billion, 1025, and on through there. You don't need it. The only reason I put that there is just to make a simple point that if money is in GR, which is our General Revenue Fund, if money's in it, it's going to get spent. I mean, just keep that point in mind. If money's in GR, it's going to get spent. We can talk about how to be restrained and everything else, but history tells us if money's in there, the legislature is going to find a way to spend it. Because the appropriations process, the way it's designed, wants to force toward reconciliation. And the path of least resistance to that is spend everything you got. And so if it's in GR, we're going to spend it. Now we've got this thing called the Economic Stabilization Fund, which is our rainy day fund. And back when I came in the legislature, it wasn't very much money. Because it's funded, we'll talk about how it's funded in a minute, but it's funded off oil and gas. And back then, you know, when gas is $6 a barrel, it doesn't raise much money. Now that oil's, you know, hanging around $4.350, and we miss higher prices, but gas is rather, and with oil hanging around the upper 90s, it's a lot of money. So now all of a sudden we've got a lot of funds. Right now, the current balance, if you look at that, is $6.69 billion. I defy any other state to do that. You know, the entire budget for the entire state of Oklahoma is $4 billion. In fact, I understand that Jeannie Morrison has a bill for next time to suggest that with our rainy day fund, we just buy Oklahoma. And, you know, make a nice county, you know, for North Texas. So, But anyway, it's $6.69 billion today. Now, just a note in that, we've recently just taken $2 billion out of that for SWIFT, for that water fund, water infrastructure fund. So it would have been, and really is, $8.69 billion. Okay, so bear that in mind. It's a lot of money. The projected balance for the end of fiscal year 15 is $8.7 billion. Now, that $8.7 billion, remember we've already taken $2 billion out, and that amount assumes that this transportation constitutional amendment is going to pass this coming November. If it doesn't pass, then we'll probably end up next year with $9.45 billion in that fund, which is a big bucket of money. So it's a serious savings account. So how's it funded? It's funded by Texas. We got this thing. I got to assume not everybody's friend, but we've got this thing called the severance tax, which is kind of like sales tax on oil and gas. I mean, for every barrel of oil that comes out, we pay like 4.6% is paid on a severance tax for gas for every million cubic feet. It's what is it? It's 7.5%. Condensate, I think, is like a 4.3, which is another kind of like, time's up already? I'm not even like near there, man. Yeah, that's a little bit better. I'm talking, man. Okay. I didn't want to get time for the pass-out period or anything. So. Okay. So, anyway, so it gets funded that way. Now, here's the confusing part I want you to get. So, how does that severance tax is what funds the rainy day fund. So, how does it get there? This is what's confusing. Read this thing with me. If the severance tax collections in any given year exceed the total amount collected in the base year of 1987, that's when they created the rainy day fund. And so they said, we don't want to cut budgets because we don't cut budget, but anything above what we got in 1987 in the severance tax, if we get above that, 75% of that's going to go into a savings account. So when you hit the amount they got in 87 off severance tax, which we always do now, then everything above that, 75% of that money is going to go into the rainy day fund. All right? Now it'll change a little bit if this transportation initiative passes in November. Then half of that money will go into a transportation fund as long as we're maintaining a minimum balance in the rainy day fund, and the other half will go into the rainy day fund. But for now, 75% of all the severance tax dollars above what we got in 1987, which is a bunch of money, goes into the rainy day fund. Got through all that dull, boring point to say this is kind of where I'm going. The rainy day fund has a cap, and bearing in mind anything that's in GR, historically the legislature is going to spend, even a conservative legislature, right? So the way the cap works, the rainy day fund is not to exceed 10% of certain GR that's deposited in the previous biennium. So you got the severance tax for all this oil and gas, it's all coming out. We get, and that money, 75% of it, goes over into the rainy day fund. And if the rainy day fund ever grows so big that it's 10% of certain GR, then it's hit its cap. Now, certain GR is defined as the total amount deposited in the GR fund during the previous biennium, except you take out investment income, interest income, and amounts borrowed from special funds. So, you have a rainy day fund. It's got a 10%. It's got a cap. It can't be more than 10% of certain GR. The comptroller tells us that for 24-15, current biennium, that the cap is probably $14 billion. So we're going to have a rainy day fund that can be edging up toward $10 billion when we come back in. If it ever was to hit $14 billion, it hits its cap. Now, what happens when it hits its cap? This is the important part. If it ever hits its cap, and everybody says, man, it'll never get there. You know, it's $4 billion short right now. Well, let me tell you, it's that short after we've already taken a bunch of money out of it. I mean, look what we took out of it to pay Medicaid at the beginning of the session. If we hadn't done that, if we hadn't done the water fund, and if we hadn't done the transportation, we'd be bumping the cap when we come back. If oil and gas stays the way it is, and it looks like it will for a while, we're going to get near that cap. When we hit the cap, here's the problem. As soon as we hit the cap, the money that would have gone into the rainy day fund now pours over into GR. And what do we all know happens when it gets into GR? It gets spent. Right, so we got to start thinking in terms. Now, most common sense folks would say, don't deal with that problem until you get there. You know, but the problem if the money ever starts pouring out of rainy day into GR, we're never going to pass anything that prevents that from happening. because we're going to want to spend the money. So my proposal is very, very simple. Again, operating off the lesson that if it ever gets to GR, it's going to get spent. So the thought is to slow the growth on government by reducing its available revenue and to deliver tax relief to the greatest number of Texans in the simplest way possible. To do this, here's what I propose. And you got to do this before there's money pouring over, because once there's money pouring over, we won't do it because we're going to want to spend that money. So what I'm proposing is to create something, a new mechanism, a new fund called the Sales Tax Reduction Fund, or STRAFE. I thought STRAFE sounded kind of good. The STRAFE in the fund. But what it would do is allow legislators, would give us the legal authority to give a sales tax reduction utilizing those monies that are above the cap in the rainy day fund. Now, the way STRAFE would work, you could fund it a couple of ways. One, if we reach the cap in the rainy day fund, which I believe we will at some point, when we reach it, any pour over money, instead of going into GR, would go into the STRAFE, the Sales Tax Reduction Fund. Also, we could have the authority at any time to appropriate GR and take that money and put it in the Sales Tax Reduction Fund. That ain't never going to happen because we want to spend GR. The other thing is we could also have it automatically take any unexpended revenue balance or surplus each biennial session. Remember, at the end of this budget year, because of the cap, we had a couple $100 million left over. So this would take any money that's left over and put it over into the Sales Tax Reduction Fund. And it would also take any money that pours over, that reaches the cap, and it would take the money that would be going into the rainy day fund, hits the cap, pour over, and it will insert it into the Sales Tax Reduction Fund. Now, I think that could grow pretty substantially. Remember, 1 penny of sales tax is about $3.5 billion. You can envision how we could have a STRAFE fund getting a substantial amount of money in it. And what we would do is give the comptroller automatic authority at any time to reduce sales tax for a limited period, for as long as the money sustains it, in an amount relative to the amount that's been deposited in the STRAFE account. So think of it this way. We have another session like we had this time, except we don't create water fund, we don't create transportation fund, and we don't put a bunch of money into Medicaid. And so we have this money, and so all of a sudden now we've got the Sales Tax Reduction Fund, rainy day funds hit its cap, money's pouring over, now all of a sudden we've got a couple of billion dollars in the STRAFE account. Into session, we've got a couple $100 million left over. So now we've got some serious money in there. The comptroller would have the authority to look and see, well, heck, that's a half penny sales tax reduction for 2 years. And she would have the authority, or he would have the authority, whoever that's going to be, to go ahead and automatically implement that. If you leave it to the legislature to do it, it ain't going to happen because we're going to find a way to reach in and spend that money. So that's the idea on the STRAFE account. I'm going to propose we pass that this next session and create it. Because I think with oil and gas, the way it is, energy independence, all these wonderful things that are happening, at some point we're going to reach that cap and all of a sudden we're going to have a lot of money going into GR that we don't want going in there. And if we wait till we have that problem, we'll never create this fund. So we need to do it now while there's no money in it, because we'll vote for it if there's no money in it, right? Okay. That's one proposal. Sorry to make it so confusing and convoluted. The other proposal is much more simple. Have y'all ever watched the appropriations floor in the House when we're hearing the bill? I know the legislators have. Some of them have watched it. I mean, you know, that have been in the legislature. But if you ever watch it, it's a all day and all night process. I mean, Jody, what have we gone? 4 in the morning, 4:30 in the morning before. And let me tell you, nothing. You know, they'll say in your mama used to tell you nothing happens good after midnight. Nothing ever happens good after midnight in the legislature. Nothing. In fact, yeah, 11 o'clock. So, if you watch, we'll have, I think this last time we had about 150 amendments filed, 272 amendments filed to the appropriations bill. Now, realistically, to really debate amendments, you might get through 30 or 40 and really do them justice in a full legislative day. We had 272 amendments filed. In addition to those amendments, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of amendments to the amendments filed. And it creates a legislative free-for-all that is not in the best the best interest of the citizens of Texas. And so the other proposal is, and this is a rulemaking thing for the House, but I think we've been doing this long enough. I think we really need to sit back and on the appropriations process, think about some limits on amendments and amendments to the amendment that can be brought up in the appropriations measure. Because frankly, once you get through the first 30 or 40 amendments, there's no telling what happens, and we always find bad things that happened. We also, a lot of good things that could have got done but happened to be filed as amendment number 264 never get the opportunity to come up. So I think that in the rulemaking, we need to take a very, very hard look at reining in that process. Talmadge was chairman of appropriations, and it was messed up when he was there too. And I think we need to take a very, very hard look at restraining that process so that we can have legitimate debate in a legitimate manner over the during the appropriations bill. And with that, thank you very much.
Representative Perry.
Lucky me, I'm the last one. I know you guys are getting glassy-eyed. I am a CPA by trade. I would call myself a grim reaper of the last 2 weeks, giving tax estimates out. For those that have not filed or will file those in the next few weeks, you're going to feel the pain of Obamacare. And it's going to average about 5 to 15%, just depending on your income brackets, and it's going to touch everyone. So that has been my week or two, and I tell people, do not shoot the messenger. It's great to be here today, and I was asked to talk a little bit about zero-based budgeting, and that's exactly what it'll be, just a little bit. It's pretty self-explanatory. However, I think I will go into a few other issues that are kind of somewhat related to that. Sitting on appropriations for the first time in my legislative career last session, it was interesting to me that as people came to us through subcommittee and even into the main committee, the first question is, well, what did you spend last year? Not the first question that, in my opinion, we should be asking. The first question I think we should have is state jurisdictional. Does the state need to be in this, first of all? Is this a priority of the state? And there are legitimate priorities of government and then state. However, there are local jurisdictional. There are federal jurisdictional. And I think because of the influx of federal funds and the interaction with county governments, we sometimes blur those lines to the point that we really don't know why the money's there, who's supposed to allocate it, spend it, or appropriate it. So in my opinion, before you ever get to how you're going to determine what number it needs to be, you need to establish, is that a state priority? Is someone already doing it? Is it being duplicated? And if it is, then maybe we need to revisit whether we need to be doing that at all. That said, the best zero-based budgeting you have is a $27 billion estimated shortfall. It will force you into a zero-based budgeting approach if done correctly. So every once in a while there is a good housekeeping and cleaning that comes from shortage of revenue. We didn't have that last session, and we see some of the results of that. So zero-based budgeting very simply just says that every line item in that budget of that agency has to be justified. And more important than the actual process of the number, it's the environment and the attitude that it establishes. I'm told, and I was not here then, but an individual named Janelle, when he was appropriations chair, was not very well liked because he did that very process as every agency came to him, had to justify every dollar in their budget and why it made sense to do that. So I'm very much an advocate of that. I think that that's something that we have to get back to. You can argue that it's too big. Well, you know what? It's too big because we don't do it. And I would also argue that my bill last session, where it gave you a 3-year rotation and there was multiple versions of that file, that's kind of a cop-out, but it was a compromise to get the ball started. If sunset's done properly, maybe you have zero-based budgeting through that process. We have a duplicate process I think we can engage. I said I'm going to leave here a little bit with some other things that are somewhat tied to this. We are in a very precarious yet opportunistic time in this state, one because of our natural resources, our surpluses or revenues. I would tell you the biggest challenge we have in our budget is the interaction with our federal dollars. And most of the time we all have good intentions and want to do a zero-based budget and want to change the format in which we're distributing funds and be more efficient. Our hands are tied. 17% of our $200 billion all funds budget are within the control of the legislature. The other 80% through constitutional statute, mandate, federal, other parameters, formula funding that's been set up by previous statutes is outside the control of the legislature. So you're not talking about a pool of money that we get to do a lot of stuff with because we've already tied our hands. That said, one good thing, or I'd say there's a couple of good things. But one good thing that did come out of the ACA or the Obamacare Act is the fact that Robert's ruling did basically say that you can't punish a state for not wanting to participate by taking current funding. So we have two choices when it comes to our Health and Human Services budget. $74 billion of all funds. It's $74 billion of all funds of the $200 billion. It is growing beyond our capacity. It will infringe on every area of the budget. There's other federal dollars out there. But here's a window of opportunity for Texas, because they need Texas worse than we need them on these issues. And we've had several bills filed, and I'm committed to saying that if we can get our health and human services, our entitlement and our incentives right to get people out of that system, we've got a window with the current administration where they have to yield some of the requests that we need to have a budget that will reflect more efficient, more effective, and do what it was intended to do, and that's get people being productive. If we're smart about it and work together and bring some bipartisan ideas to the table, we've got a window here in Texas that we can change the dynamics of how this state budgets across the country go. So that's a positive to me. And where I go with that is I've had some ideas. They're not ready for prime time, but we do have to revisit safety nets. It's hard for an individual that's on a safety net working two jobs, trying to keep two kids fed, that's got a safety net. And if she bumps her raise $3 an hour over the next 6 months, she loses all the safety net. We got to be smarter than that, and I think it can be a conservative initiative if we bring that and discuss all parameters and check out the entire budget and how those interact. We've got to come up with an alternative for, instead of removing the rug completely out from that individual, have them phase off and have the employer participate because they've got a better employee. We've got to figure out that dynamics, and when we do it, everybody in this country will, and the federal government will have less control. You know, with federal dollars, we got two options. We can coerce every individual in the state to quit sending their federal withholding, and that's not going to happen. That's just going to be tyranny. So we're not going to get there. But we can, I think, in this current environment we work in, because of the ACA and some of the rulings on that, if we're smart, we can redefine and redesign our health and human service, our entitlements, and how we work with individuals and make them productive citizens with the help until they don't need it anymore. That's an initiative that I'm interested in. I hope TPPF and I and other groups can come together and work on that. That said, I want some time for the questions, and I won't talk. And it's very seldom that politicians don't talk longer than the non-politicians, but I hope there's a good time. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the panel. If you have a question, raise your hand. Can you pass the mic around, Peyton? It's important to speak into the mic so it can be recorded.
About 12 or 13 years ago, Dr. Vedder did a study for Texas Public Policy Foundation about taxes in Texas, and your findings were that states that relied most heavily on income taxes had negative economic growth. Property taxes, it was kind of neutral, and sales taxes, it was actually positive, that the more you relied on sales taxes, not that sales taxes should go higher, but the more of a reliance on sales taxes, the higher economic growth was. So my question to both of you, Dr. Vedder and Representative King, is there any way to pass on a property tax reduction as opposed to a sales tax reduction, knowing that there's no state property tax, but could you pass that down through the school districts or something to do a property tax reduction?
You know, the jam is, here's the problem with property tax, why it's so hard to do anything with it, is because of the school situation we have. And as long as we've got Robin Hood and the current case law and the current statute and the current constitutional requirement, until that's changed, it's hard for us to, because every time if we force a school property tax reduction, which is 70% of most people's property tax bill, then the state ends up having to make up the difference for it. In other words, if we let them lower it down, then we got to go make up the money by court order. So and so that's an issue. At the municipal level, the state doesn't have a state sales tax. So, I mean property tax, we just have sales tax. So if we had a state property tax, then I think, because I hate property tax and I like sales tax, if you can like a tax. But since if we had a state tax, then we could say, yeah, let's raise the sales tax and lower the state property tax. But since we don't have a state property tax, I can't really figure out how we could do it. although the concept and the intention, because you're always better off. I mean, even Greenspan in his book, when he quit being in the Fed, you know, he said if you could start over, you'd make everything consumption taxes.
Yes, Dr. Butter.
I would just agree with what was. I would just agree with. I don't know how you get around your constitutional and institutional constraints, Robin Hood, and so forth, which are convoluted, by the way, to an outsider. As one who's looked at Texas public school finance, I just shake my head at what you've done. But it's there. But to the extent you can rely on consumption taxes and not tax production or the means of production, you're better off. Property taxes are a tax on the means of production very often. Income taxes certainly are a tax on productive activity. So you want to move in the direction of consumption taxes as much as you can. And whether that means long-term, in constitutional reform, you may want to think about ways you can reform your constitution, but that's sort of a long-term, not a short-term proposition. Thanks, Jeff, for the question.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for a very thorough overview. It's very relevant information. My question is regarding the local debt that we're in the state of Texas. We're number 2 in the nation, and that comes a lot through school and city and county bonds. Do you have any input, and this is to the entire panel, do you have any input on how the best practices on how to determine excessive bonds and ways to go about defeating them?
I can tell you this, that on a local level, most of that debt's from schools. And a good example is a $64 million football field just in East Texas. And until local taxpayers are educated, and there was some legislation last session that tried to raise the level of transparency and understand that what that really means to them, it's going to be hard to change that curve. And I think from a state's perspective, it's real hard to go into a community and try to micromanage, especially when it comes to schools. So that the answer is, I think, is education. You know, our republic's built around the premise that you're going to have informed and engaged electorate, and we don't have that, and that's why we have the problems we have. And debt, I think, is a symptom of that. But if your local people are going to be uninformed and voted in, or informed and voted in, that's going to be a trend. Now, I think property tax is a huge issue, but we've got so many things to fix around that, and that kind of ties into all that. But I don't have any easy answers for what makes a local to do it, other than to let people at the local level know that that's what it means. And I have an active group in my area that when you tell them that information, they do pause. We did pass a $200 million bond election in my district 4 years ago. They're talking about another one. Word on the street, that's not going to go, because we did raise the level of awareness, the fact that if you do that, then you'll have this much in billions in debt on a local level. So as long as you get the facts out in TPPF, and I think Representative King said Alex going to do a local level kind of education format, but the more education the voters have, the better they are, and that's the only way I know to combat that.
A quick comment. If you cut your operating expenses, you don't have to go for as much debt. We have funded our capital expenditures in our new cities. 20% of our operating budget goes to capital expenditures on average for the past 8 years, which has meant basically we didn't have to borrow. So being more efficient in your operations, and I advocate the use of private industry to do that, will negate a lot of the debt that you might have to go into, because you can take it out of your everyday income.
I do have one additional comment, and he raised it for me. You know, the state of Texas, as good as it is very short-sighted when it comes to deferred maintenance. Local school districts are very short-sighted when it comes to deferred maintenance. And what that is they don't pay for maintenance on property and facility, and then they come to the voters after 20 years of dilapidation and say, we need a $100 million bond to go back and fix this. And that's happening at the state. The state has unfunded liability and deferred maintenance of several $100 million, and we do the same thing. It comes in and it gets denied, and at one point they bundle it all up and put it in a bond debt. So as you go through your school board elections, You need to find people that are fiscally minded and responsible enough to not to kick that can down the road that will make that a budget priority. So, because typically those bond elections center around building new or rebuilding old or remodeling old and updating old. And if that becomes a budgetary item and a priority in it, you won't have these big bond requests down the road unless it's a fast growth school.
I hate to cut the discussion off, but we are over our allotted time. Help me thank the panel again for their work. The next panel in this room will be getting rid of unnecessary